Hey, fellow Geonters, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we are getting to the tail end of this little series we've been doing about attachment theory and Tantra and this idea of karma mudra, the sort of tantric relationship stuff. We'll probably wrap this little section up specifically on attachment theory and then let this subject matter go for a little bit. Once we get something out of the toothpaste out of the tube, we'll tend to come back to it later or something because there's probably more
Yeah.
things for us to talk about with karma mudra. But got to keep the conversation lively. We'll move on to some new things. We got some ideas cooking about where to go next. But for this episode, we're going to really talk about attachment theory and Tantra specifically and kind of throw out our final thoughts and ideas about this.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, that's the subject matter of today. As we've been trying to do at the beginning of the podcast, too, though, if you can help us out by doing a little of the things everyone asks you to do, like, subscribe, and all the good things, that would be great. So we can fight the evil demiurge of the algorithm to get this spiritual stuff out to people. So, all right, hopefully do the things and we'll get on with our little conversation here. So this is a little bit more freestyle because we did a really deep dive into the whole detail of the theory, have people, learn about it and see what applies to them. And this is maybe to think about this in terms of spirituality. So we'll go back and forth, I suppose, Daniel, and just kick this around, right? For me, one of the things that popped into my mind first about this was we're kind of doubling back to this idea of like karmic relationship, karma mudra relationship, and healing these things up and establishing these things. And one of the things that really hit me was there's no there's no perfect solution to the problem of relationship between people. I just
Right.
don't, right? There's no um there's no absolute like perfect way to solve relationship problem in the big picture sense, right? No absolute solution to that. There's no like absolute life hack that solves all of these things. And I was just thinking a lot of it has to do with, from a spiritual point of view, just the idea that we are in what you might call samsara, right? This kind of fancy Buddhist word, but maybe one of the ways of talking about the samsara idea is that like we're in an imperfect place.
Yeah.
This world is imperfect. We all have our flaws and imperfections, right? And so to say that there's some perfect way to do this, like that just isn't going to happen, right?
Mm.
And I'm sure you feel the same way too.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, for me, because we like to do things kind of personal on this podcast, for me, this is kind of like a big deal. You know, we haven't done it yet, but one of the things in the pipeline to do sometime off in the future is a little bit of spiritual astrological stuff. And there's especially this idea of like figuring out kind of where your tikkun is, to use some Kabbalah language, where you really feel like your astrological thing that you're working towards is. And for me, it has a lot to do with this relationship aspect of things. For people who might know some astrology, the way I'm talking about this will be Pisces in the North Node in the seventh house. So Pisces will have to do with spiritual questions, and the seventh house will have to do with relationships. If you don't know astrology, don't worry about it. We got people who are interested in that. But when you blend those two things together, I feel like this is a really important thing for me on a personal level, the spirituality of relationships and trying to just figure that out. It's a major sort of, you might say, karmic question within my life. So I think about that quite a bit. And then this attachment theory kind of fits into that too. How do you work this out and how do you find the spiritual aspect of these things? I'll throw it back to you, Daniel, though. How do you feel about that? How important is that to you? It feels astrologically and karmically important for me, but we all have our own things that are important to us.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to figure out what aspect you mean is important.
Well, I mean, like, I think this is a really core spiritual question in my life, right?
Oh, just like attachments in general,
Yeah,
relationships.
I think relationship and spirituality, how those things get kind of blended together really matters
Sure.
for me, right?
Yeah. I
And
mean,
then
I guess,
all these things that have to do with relationship attachment theory and all the other stuff that
yeah.
is one of the things we talk about on
Yeah.
this show.
If you take the larger view, right? And we look at this from like a Buddha Dharma Sangha, right? So you're talking about your own soul, your own spirit, the teachings and the experience of those teachings as the Dharma, and the Sangha is the community of people, right? And we can call it, congregation if you want to use a more Christian kind of term, a flock, if you will.
Mhm.
that those that as a group of people, it's only a group because there's individual relationships that are collectively added up in order to equal a group, right? And so those kinds of people who are in this, spiritual tradition are helping to support those people around them to remind them of whatever. Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, doesn't matter, you know?
Mhm.
But those are based on those are links in the chain. Those are Legos. One on top of the other on top of the other creates the entirety of the Lego. And so in what we're talking about is really interaction, you know,
Mhm.
and how your interactions with people affect you, affect them, and they how they affect others. And then how your, we've done a couple episodes now on like, I'm not going to call it childhood attachment theory, but essentially that's what it kind of was based on,
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
and how that affects how you interact with people moving forward in a romantic partnership or and also not in a romantic partnership, how you show up as a person on your half, on your side of the relationship. But because it doesn't matter how many links in the chain there are, the only link that matters is the one that is weakest. You will essentially have to be as mindful as you can about your own shit, basically, And so this kind of observation puts forth the obligation of the person to do their own work, not just for themselves, but for their partners, right? For their relationship partners, but then for their coworkers, for their family members, and then obviously with the greater community. So for me, unless you are a hermit, which there are very few of these, are people who live outside of society. And there, I mean, there's greater or lesser degrees of people who live in more rural areas, but we are not separate from each other by any means. I didn't make any of my clothes. You didn't make any of your clothes. And my guess is most of our listeners didn't make any of their clothes. We're interrelated far more than we even can fathom on a general basis. So this kind of dive into the inner workings of relationships, or at least what we have opened up, from a spiritual perspective and from a practical perspective, hashtag Capricorn, um, is is an essential part of what we're already doing, and part of our larger mission is to enlighten people to the subconscious things that they're unaware of, and having human interaction is something everybody has. So at a baseline, you could pay attention to how you do that and then maybe figure out why you do some of the things that you do so you could become better at the thing that you're definitely going to do. Because you are never not going to see and work with people. Even if you don't quote unquote work with people, you're still working with people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, there's no way around like the working with people.
Ain't gonna happen.
No matter where you're going, there's gonna be somebody else staring back at you. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So if I like think about like these questions of relationship and attachment and where like I've had issues around this, it gets a little bit back to this idea of where I would feel my karma kind of lies, which is trying to figure out how do you create spiritually profound relationships with other people. I'm really trying to figure out how to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
As again, like part of my spiritual process. It's like, again, we can look at it from this idea of tikkun. This is what I'm trying to work on and explore and understand. And some of this gets back to this idea of sort of our uniqueness and exclusiveness thing, right? Just to get that out of the way, because I was thinking like, how do we talk about this? And inevitably, that question kind of comes up whenever we're doing relationship stuff. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really good as a podcast to have people on with different perspectives on this, right?
Yeah.
So, we have Phaedra on periodically. I know you're doing a lot of stuff with her, and you talk about this from her perspective, which is
Yeah.
much more open relationship perspective,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. For sure.
And for me, we use these words uniqueness and exclusiveness kind of coming from Esther Perel. We talked about it a lot before, but it's just this idea that like exclusivism is more sort of traditional relationship styles, more like the closed relationships. Uniqueness has this idea of maybe the more open relationship kind of styles, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
that the power of the relationship comes from framing it as something special between those two people and not
Mm.
thinking structure of the thing is, and exclusivism having a much more of an emphasis on traditional relationship structure,
Mm.
and especially the idea that we're only going to share things between the two of us. And
Right.
so I thought about this stuff kind of a lot because to me, like at the heart, it's a hard thing to talk about, but to me, at the heart of this attachment theory thing is kind of like two sets of needs. Let me kind of double back on it to pull it together to the attachment stuff to my mind.
Sure.
So I think about that. I think, well, if we look at it, that's two sets of needs. One set of needs has to do with feeling secure, right?
Sure.
Having that part met. This kind of idea of like the safe haven idea. And the other part has a lot to do with like what they were calling the secure base. This idea, can you go out and explore the world, right? And then how do you find some kind of balance between those two things? And I mean, I think that that's like just a really challenging thing for each of us to try to figure out what that means to us, right?
Mm.
You think about that within your own life too?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, not so much.
Well, I think when you were talking, what the question I was asking myself when you were talking that I had a hard time deviating from was
Uh-huh.
when you talked about cultivating a spiritual relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe if I just broaden that just a bit and I'd say deeply meaningful relationship, right? Because that's kind of how
Yeah.
we're. And I think that like that is such a an interesting question just to pose to people who are listening. A, what are your significant relationships? And I know family is not always in that list of, whatever. But then if we're going to talk about that, like, are is that something that like you have found, or is it something that I'm more curious about, found you? Now, obviously, once you're past the NRE, as we like to call it, the new relationship energy of the thing, and I'm not even talking about romantic, I'm talking about like meaningful relationships, which could be romantic, but otherwise poly or
That's
monogamish.
NRE is like polylingo anyways.
Yeah,
Most
for
people have
sure. Yeah,
it.
we're in
Yeah.
it, right? It's
Yeah, yeah.
hot.
Uh-huh.
But then I don't know. I feel like the relationship, I think, and we've talked about this before, Eric. So, this is a little bit old hat, but like, I think it's less about finding those things and it's more about allowing those relationships because much like yourself and me as well, and I'm not sure of the audience. Hold on. Let me ask them. Oh, that's right. I can't hear you. So you're going to have to hit us up at ginandtantra@gmail.com or slide into the DMs on the gram at Gin and Tantra Podcast or leave a comment in the YouTube section. You like that? That's so slick that I just do that at any point. You guys have to understand the level of awareness. I'm like a radio show host that doesn't get paid to do this. So, but
Yeah.
anyways, I feel like you have to be in places and be open to these relationships and say yes to them and then put the effort into them because much like yourself and myself, there are have been numerous deep connections that I found that could have been really expansive in my life and potentially in their life as well. And sometimes it's romantic, but not always.
Mhm.
That people don't they're not willing to open themselves up to that. It's almost like it's too much or something else. And there's a difficulty in them allowing themselves to experience this kind of a thing. And both you and I have had these conversations off mic in particular about the importance of A, finding these people, and then B, more importantly, recognizing their importance, that they are rare. They're it's not your standard, you know, and there's nothing wrong with standard friendships where you could come over and watch the football game or, go have coffee and enjoy each other's company or whatever. We're talking about the like the very kind of like small but important gears that make the big machine go. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? That these things have to be honored. They really, really do because they don't just pop up every day. They really don't. And so once you find them and you acknowledge them, then the work starts. Then the attachment theory comes in so that you can kind of work and make sure that you're not pulling when they're pushing and vice versa. Does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
yeah, yeah. And I think that like I was, we did one of our first Jin and Tantra meditation retreats over the
Yeah.
last 5 or 6 days. Went really awesome. Hopefully you see, hopefully see people again or see new people who might be listening to this when we do this thing again at some point. But I had like a really interesting conversation with one of the retreat participants Had a lot of interesting conversations with a lot of retreat
There was a
participants.
lot of good conversations happening.
A lot of good stuff happening. But one of the guys was basically saying, your worldview is really, really Buddhist, like really, really Buddhist. And I was like, sometimes when it's something so deep, you don't even really think about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So I was like, yeah, I guess that's true. Like I'm all in on this, after so many years of doing this too. And it's so ingrained in who I am.
yeah,
I realized for the attachment theory stuff we were talking about, it's ingrained in that sense too. I think, in a way, I think very similar to what you were describing. When I think about the world, I think, well, we're all spirit that's entwined with matter for this time. We have these karmic resonances with the people around us, right? In different ways,
right,
very Buddhist kind of thinking, right? Some of those things are very profound and very deep cultivations that might have happened, in the Buddhist way, even over lifetimes. But in any case, things that like are very, you could almost say like alchemically profound, right? And so my way of trying to deal with like attachment stuff, if I look at it honestly, has been go through and said, well, okay, I'm going to see if I can find my peeps.
yes,
I will connect with those peeps, and that will be how my attachment needs will be met. And this has worked to varying degrees of like success in the way I look at it, right?
yeah,
I've had, deep interactions with people. In a certain sense, I can't complain. And again, I kind of come from this uniqueness perspective. I have that's okay. I can make connections with other people and, I have relationships that can be more open in that way.
right.
And again, and some of this have been friendships, some have been more romantic relationships or, things where there's more of that kind of romantic qualities to them.
Saucy.
Some of them have been saucy, some have been frisky, some have been like, as we would say in other episodes, some of them have been a little bit more like demisexual,
Oh, Demi.
demisexual, the emotional connections, saposexual. What is that called? Saposexual.
Yeah, Sapio. Yeah, let me do that's that. I mean, that's my jam for
The
sure.
one that you love people's minds.
I do.
Yeah, me
It's a,
too.
it's
Hottest thing there is.
the
The mind,
blessing and a
the
curse.
hottest thing. Yeah. Yep. Mind makes it hot.
Yeah, it does.
So it's one of the things where I can't complain, but this also has been one of the major sort of things to figure out in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in a way, I think what I realize when I think about attachment theory, I think of, well, there is a way where you could say your exclusivism, that your one attachment is to this one person,
Right.
right? Primary thing. Or for me, uniqueness, where I'm gonna have like attachment that might be a little bit more kind of spread out a bit, right? I won't look for, that one person who's gonna be like the single attachment or something. I
Right.
don't,
Yeah. The one.
but it's kind of weird in the sense that I realize from what the person was telling me at the retreat, I was like, oh yeah, that flows really naturally out of my worldview, right? Because I think in this way, I tend to think, oh no, we're interconnected beings,
Right.
all of us interconnected,
Right.
but for this lifetime more so in the way that we have a certain resonance with one another, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then resonances. And I realized, oh, that actually flows like really naturally out of my whole worldview. And so I think for me, what I'm trying to share is this idea like, yeah, I realized that my whole way of thinking about these things is sort of an outgrowth of this underlying kind of way of like looking at everything, kind of, right? At
Mm-hmm.
the I don't think I had thought about that before. Obviously, we've even had these conversations a little bit before, but the clarity of it was quite striking. And then I started to think, okay, well, how can we talk about this in a way that will be helpful to different people? And I was realizing, like, okay, for me, I started to think this uniqueness is a sort of a way of like being in the world, right? It's a certain kind of philosophy. I grabbed this little book over here. I'll do the best I can with this, called Buddhist Philosophy.
Who was it by?
It is by, it's a kind of an old commentary from the school of the Dalai Lamas. And it's kind of like two modern authors, especially this Daniel Kozer is kind of a big person in talking about Buddhist scholarship. Doesn't look too good
Okay.
on, a little bit fuzzy. But anyways, we put maybe to a link to it later. But it was interesting because I thought, well, one of the things they do in these old Buddhist books is they talk about this idea of like, what are the tenets of different ways of looking at the world? And this word tenets is a very Buddhist sounding word, word, but what they mean is like what's the underlying philosophy that people take into their lives, right? And so they in these old books they go through and they say, well, here's what Hindus think, and here's what Taoists think. From our Buddhist perspective, we're going to describe the different worldviews.
Okay.
I kind of realized like, well, as I take a step back and I was trying to think about it, I realized like, well, this uniqueness thing for me fits into like a whole worldview, right? It's actually like a natural outgrowth of how I look at like life in general, right? It all has a certain coherence to me, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. I want to be able to also to understand, this more exclusiveness kind of mindset. And I begin to realize for myself, oh, that's a like almost like a different set of tenets. That's like an underlying different philosophy for people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought for this episode, when I was thinking about it, I was kind of going, okay, well, that means that in part of the conversation for me is to go, okay, so how would an exclusiveness person think about this? And then what are the issues that they're going to face that might be different than mine, right? When they're trying to figure out these attachment things for themselves.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, for me, then I was kind of going, all right, well, what are the issues involved in this, And when I go back to the main question, which is something like there's two different sets of needs, right? There's these more yin needs that you feel like you're secure, and there's more yang needs where you feel like you get to explore the world or
Right.
something.
Right. Right. Right.
And what are the challenges of that, right? I can talk about it from my perspective, but I also, know most of the people that are going to be listening are going to be much more like exclusiveness minded people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was curious what you think about that whole set of issues because, depending on the style of how you're going to live your life and what your underlying belief system is, you're going to be faced with like different kinds of challenges. So I think one of the big challenges of the exclusiveness thing is going to be that you're going to have like a big emphasis placed on security needs, right? But in general, you're going to also maybe have less of that exploratory quality of being out in the
Mm.
world, at least with other people,
Well, I
a
mean,
little bit more potentially cut off.
in shout out to the one of the episodes that I did with Phaedra. I think it was the last one that we recorded. We talked about like safety and spontaneity or security and spontaneity as
Yeah.
two requirements for a relationship, but their 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 dichotomy is required. And if you move too far one way or the other, you lose the other important part because they're equally important. So if you're in anything of any length, you have to have security because it has to feel safe for you so that you can relax, be vulnerable emotionally, physically, all the other things. You can't be kinky if you're scared about the other person injuring you. For the most part, I know there's some other things that I might not be aware of.
Outside of like, kinkiness, even like normal sexuality, you can't open
Yeah,
your feel
yeah.
secure.
So for the most part, you have to feel safe in order to express yourself, express your limits, express all the other things, or else everything is just gonna be bound up. You're gonna be in a fight or flight kind of spot. You're not interested in being sexy or being open. But then on the other hand, when you have that, if you're not also conscious about keeping things spontaneous, then you lose the exploratory part, which is what you're probably going to talk about in a second. But the exploratory part, I think there's two pieces to it. There's the exploratory part of the world, right? Which is kind of like half of it. But the other half is the exploratory part of yourself in the relationship. Or maybe
Mhm.
we even say yourself and the relationship because those two things they're mirror images of each other. Moving out and moving in is moving, but if you're unsecure in your relationship, then you don't have that kind of home base in order to work from. It's not there, so you don't feel like if I'm not tethered to something, if I'm not grounded here, then I might just float away, and then you leave. And now your attachment stuff comes to play. Are you avoidant, anxious, blah, blah, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree with it. I also like again, like it's weird for me because I'm like trying to look at this and be as honest as possible about these things. And part of it is if you're going to like be with this same person for like years and years and years and decades and decades and decades, like
Yeah.
that's physically not that easy,
No.
right? And I don't want to like, if we're going to talk honestly in this podcast the way we like to, I don't want to like minimize that. Like that's actually, quite a difficult thing. And when you get to the attachment part, on the one hand, you get lots and lots of safe haven,
Hmm.
right? But then it's challenging, right? In the sense that, well, how do I get the secure base thing, or how do I get, you know, this element of yang and excitement? I mean, I realized this somehow back in the day, too. I was like studying Taoism and Zen and these things. And I said, yeah, there's really like two sets of needs here that are tricky to figure out how you're going to get those met. And I just want to be honest about it, right?
Hmm.
One side is I do think that if you don't have that feeling of security, then I think it'll trigger the shit out of your attachment stuff, no matter who you are. I do think that's true, right? But on the other hand, I think, I don't know, culturally, as a worldview, right? The way you're trying to solve these sets of problems, certainly in the context of the culture in which we live, then you have this thing where, okay, I'm gonna get a lot of a certain kind of security, but then, I have this very difficult problem of what do I do to keep generating more of that yang and more of that excitement. I think we just
Mm.
have to be as honest as we can about that. So what do you think about that set of questions, right? In the context of like the exclusivism thing, it's not that easy, right?
No. No, no, it's really not. No, I mean it's not, but you said
Oh, it's
it.
a real honest answer, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It's like it's the simplest thing to say, but it's one of the most complicated things everyone's gonna have to try to figure out how to deal with. It's not easy.
Correct.
Yeah. You got thoughts?
No. It's not, I mean, there's not much to be, I mean, more than, I mean, I just said it really, right? And with it, so I don't know that I mean, there's so much more to be said in terms of like ways and things, but we've done so many episodes on this at this point. Like it's a complicated topic. I feel like we've done a pretty good justice up until this point, just in general.
Yeah, but it like has to do with back to this thing of this attachment theory. How do you get these two sets of needs met? It's not small at all.
No, no. Well, I mean, the answer is always you have to be it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if you are a safe haven for somebody, then hopefully that gets reciprocated in a relationship. And if you understand what you are willing to accept and then what you are not willing to accept, then I think you will be able to see the limits to which you can exist in a relationship authentically as yourself, but then also be ready to be like, okay, this is not you're not, I am providing so much more for you than you are for me. And while that might be good for a time, ultimately this is a kind of a one-way thing. And I just don't find that to ever be healthy in the long run for people because God forbid the person who is the provider, and I'm not even talking about financially, you know what I'm saying? I'm talking, right? If they need something, the habit is already set for the other person to just be the receiver. And of course, relationships are dynamic and things change over time. But I just don't know how that I don't know how that works if this person is in a prolonged state of discomfort or a prolonged state of emotional need. Where are they going to turn to? They're going to have to find outside sources. And that's not fair for them who has been such a deep provider for the other one when they've needed it. So I just think it's a very complicated kind of issue. And it really requires people to show up. Because if you're going to do the exclusive thing, then you got to do it. You have to do it as if there are multiple people living inside that person, even though it's one person. You got to tend to all their things. That's your job, and the vice versa. And I just, it's an interesting this because we're friends with Phaedra, and she comes on and we talk about this. She's in the poly lifestyle. She has, you know, different engagements with people. I don't want to speak too much for her, but she has people who she just not just, but who she texts with, or might hang out for coffee with, and it's not always a sexual thing, but
Yeah.
there's emotional intimacy there, and
Hmm.
then she has primary partner or primary partners where it's deep connection, and when stuff comes up, it pulls things up and out of her, and she has to work through it. No different than with you know you and a primary partner or me and you know what I'm saying? It's the same. Is the same things. It's just more frequent because you have more of these people that are yanking at your chain. you
Or
know?
maybe interesting in some ways because there's variety in your experience, right?
Hmm. But
So
it's
in that
work.
sense, that's a different answer to how you solve that dilemma, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like a different solution of how you get sort of the exploratory needs met or something, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
what do you think about this question of like attachment and like separation, divorce, these kinds of things, right?
Mm.
You know, when I think about this, again, like we talked about at different times, but my folks were from a different generation of people where you just didn't do that, right? And I wonder about this, you know, the culture's evolved, right?
Hmm.
Or at this point where there's going to be a lot of like kind of like separations in this way. And I wonder like what this does to people's sort of whole internal attachment mechanisms. You make these deep bonds that maybe last for a certain amount of time. And then, you know, it's a really weird situation where that, you know, eventually, because, you know, ultimately you might feel like, no, I have to go out and explore the world in some new way, and I can't do this in the context of this thing. So the exploratory aspect starts to dominate, pull you away from what otherwise might have been the secure thing that you built with this person. And then
Mm.
things like kind of shattering, right?
Hmm.
So I don't know what that does. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know the answer.
Yeah,
And it's from my own life, actually. Like I've lived a different
sure.
kind of, it's one of those things I do wonder about, you know, what happens then, you know, you know, what kind of attachment things that people are gonna have to work through from that when these things are gonna get broken. Because it seems like it's gonna be kind of typical for how a lot of people are gonna live now, right?
Yeah.
In this
Well,
thing for a while and then that will break. And I remember like when I was training martial arts, I was talking with one of the guys there who's sort of one of the more senior instructors, American guy. And we were studying like Japanese martial arts, Shotokan. And he was saying, you know, it's so wild for, I remember he was talking about it's so wild for me to look at my son because he'll be with someone for 5 or 6 years and then he'll just break and move on to the
mhm.
next thing, break. And it was sort of like so weird for him to even think about that. I'm like, well, that's kind of like more of a normal thing now, but I don't know what that means in terms of like the underlying sort of attachment aspects within people. And I don't know if you
Hmm.
have thoughts on that or not, but I wanted to throw it out because it's obviously it's going to be a big problem for a lot of people who are going to be listening to this, figuring out what to do about that, right?
Yeah, so I feel like this, I was thinking about it when you're talking, and I feel like there's a couple things that are factual, right? Divorce, 50%, right?
Yeah.
That's the rate. So whether people are doing about it or not, they're involved in it. So that means that 50% of the people are staying together, staying married. I guess we're talking about
Yep.
marriage. Okay, fine. I know people who are all over the spectrum. I'm a child of a, what someone would consider a broken household, which is obviously a dated term,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
But there is still some stigma, but not as much because it's more commonplace. So that's 50%. But the other part is that like if you look at the corporate environment today, promote like multiple promotions within a company are it's less common.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Whereas before, just like in traditional relationships, you would find one job and you'd stick with it for your life, you know, and that if you changed a job or changed a career was like a big deal, like changing a relationship.
Thing about that is my dad had that worldview even when he was advising my brother and I. Don't I'll let you get back to your flow, but it was interesting when you're saying that because he's an
Yeah.
old dude and he was like, I worked my way from the mailroom up to the top, you know, from the lowest thing to the more higher white collar, better playing kind of
Yes.
gig. Did that thing,
Yes.
right? Old school, you know? And
Yes.
then I think for like, yeah, maybe my brother's done some of that, but you can't count on that anymore, right? For sure.
No, in fact, it's the opposite. Now, in order to make the big moves, you you're not forced to, but you definitely have to look outside of the organization for sure. Like it's almost kind of like, well, let me see if they have what I want here. Oh, they don't? Okay, cool. Well, I'm not going to wait. I'm going to build my resume and find where I'm going to go, and I'm going to make diagonal moves, laterally diagonal to different companies until eventually you get yourself in a C-suite or whatever it is that you're wanting to do. And I feel like that is representative of relationships, and people are aware of this you
Yeah,
know
yeah,
and I think and that is what it is. So you have to be sort of adaptable. I want to use the word tactile you know but you have to be a tactician in
yeah.
that environment because that's how it is. So you have to, in order to adapt, you want to be successful, you have to know that. On so that's the other that's kind of like the other part. But I think in a grander scheme, it is, and it speaks on society, which, foreshadowing, we are going to be talking about society very soon because we live in it and we are not in a vacuum. So don't worry, we'll be dunking on your favorite idiots soon. But to this is the way that it is. And so I think people are far more adapt to doing this. So like, whereas your dad, and I talked with one of my clients about this, and he's like 65 at this point, 66. He said, when I was growing up, he goes, you worked for one, maybe two companies your whole career. He's like, I know my kids are probably going to work for a half a dozen companies and might change their career a couple times. He goes, but me growing up, it wasn't unheard of, but it was a rarity. And that's just the reality of things today. So I think things shift a little bit more. People's attention spans are shorter, so they're more willing to entertain the idea of change. Things are questioned more. It's not like you don't have two kids, a dog, a house, white fence, and then you're good. You just settle in. That the world is far more connected. There is a lot more cross-cultural communication, intentionally or unintentionally, even from different countries. So people have different wants, different, needs because of those wants, and therefore they're willing to accept stuff that was not culturally acceptable not that long ago. But the one thing I could say about culture is that it's constantly changing. And so in 20 years from now, I don't know that we're having this exact same conversation. It might be something slightly moved one way or the other, depending on how society reflects what it is that is happening now. If all of that ties up into a box.
Well, you think about like the security needs around that though. When you start getting this kind of thing, right? Like even when we were doing the retreat, we had some interesting conversations with this about, people who've been through divorces and separations and things, right? And how,
Okay.
right?
So
So there's a kind of a feeling of like, even in what you're talking about otherwise, there's this feeling of like uncertainty over everything,
yes.
right? I could get downsized, right? And I could
Yeah.
get downsized in my work life. I can also get downsized in my home life
Yep.
too. And then when you get back to these attachment needs, you start thinking, okay, so how do people really feel that inside? I guess I'm throwing that out to the audience too.
Mm,
I'll look at that and saying, okay, we're all doing the best we can, but when I turn inside and really look at that for myself, what do I actually feel going on in there? Do I feel
mm.
those attachment insecurities and anxieties? It's an interesting question to me.
It's interesting, Eric, because on one hand, you would think that the external uncertainty would drive people to want to find security.
Yeah.
And therefore, there would be maybe an increase in longer term relationships or an increase in marriages strictly for, I know that shouldn't be this way or whatever, but like financial reasons.
Well, I think I know people who like, again, and within the confines of like the attachment theory thing, you do have this pressure to find some partner that you can feel like, okay, I can be secure with them, right? And some of that is
Mm-hmm.
financial security, right?
Mm-hmm.
Build a life that will make me feel secure, right? It's not a
Mm-hmm.
small question for people, right?
No. But
Yeah.
given that the divorce rate is still 50%, I don't know that that's necessarily any stronger than it was. Now, obviously, I'm using that stat as a measurement for long-term relationships. There's plenty of people, and marriage is not as in fashion as it once was, you know? You could totally cohabitate. It's not. So I realize for those who are listening and you're like, hey, that's a bad stat. Yeah, I know, because I don't walk around with like relationship stats just
It's hard to know which way it would go because maybe when you're not married, it's easier for people to separate. It might actually be more than 50% otherwise, because you start to get all
right.
of the property things and all that kind of stuff going on, kids and whatever.
Yes,
Legalities, Uncle Sam gets involved in your life, all of a sudden,
exactly.
it probably gives you more incentive to stay on some level,
On
right?
some level, but I think people are far more okay with change because the uncertainty is so prevalent.
So do you think that is kind of like a good thing because it allows you to challenge the fears that would be involved in the attachment thing?
That's
Because
a
I think
really
some way or another, spiritually, you're going to have to challenge this some way or another, right? Fears have to be challenged and overcome, otherwise they don't resolve, right? There's one of
correct.
the Taoist, like TCM people, that says you're going to have your curriculum of your life. It's kind of a Taoist phrase, and you better like come to terms with these things when you have the opportunity to do it. So if it's fear, you're going to have to deal with it. So, anyways, I didn't mean to like, but it's
No.
think about like, so what do you think? Do you think it helps people deal with more of the fear of this, by kind of, you get tossed into the situation, you have to learn how to cope with those things? Do you
I
think if
mean,
there's a positive side to that?
Eric, you're asking a very deep existential question that I am not sure people think about, to be totally honest. I mean,
That's what this
fear.
podcast is about.
Yeah,
I
no, I mean,
want to be able to say, hey, what do we think about this? Because it's not small.
it's not
Mhm.
small. So this is a question, right? So this is a very deep question. So people who are listening, I think you have to ask this question, you really have to ask this question. Are you actively, consciously, intentionally trying to see, feel, I'm not going to say isolate, but I'll say identify your fears. And then if the answer is yes, then how do we address them? And this fear around security, insecurity definitely gets talked about, I think, in some kind of maybe like modern spiritual, ideology, if you want to call it this, because they talk about abundance, right? The universe is abundant. They talk about this as like a thing, in the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
manifestation groups,
In the
right?
New Age
And
stuff.
so they're trying, I think, in some way to address the idea of scarcity, whether it be financial, emotional, or otherwise. And so they're trying to address this deeper fear. But the larger percent of the population doing that? My guess is no. I
Mhm.
mean, they might do it. People do it, I think, with their friends, right? They talk about things or, in hushed tones.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But as a collective, there is not a, there isn't a ubiquitous ideology of self-reflection that pervades this or many cultures and around the world. And I don't think nor it never really has, or it ever really has specifically. And that is left to the people who are introspective, philosophical, intelligent, and who are in a place that they are secure enough that they can have resources in order to move inwards. So I'm talking about self-actualized people or people who are on that trajectory, right? So on like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that sort of top of the pyramid. And in a yogic sense, these are people who are existing above transaction, people who are existing a little bit above daily struggles. Because if you're struggling for your existence, these kind of conversations don't, this is like, get out of here. We don't even have time to talk about this. I have to work two jobs to feed my children and to keep myself in this apartment or in this house because we're on the borderline.
Just one little thing about that, because I've always had a little bit of a skeptical part about this little interpretation of Maslow, right?
Sure.
One tiny little thing about this, right? Which is that I think regardless of where you're at, you still have those questions in your mind, right? You could be like in the worst like economic straits. And we've talked to people with this, and it's not like they
Yeah.
don't have existential questions. They do. They're
Yeah.
thinking, so anyways, that's my one caveat on that. You know what I mean? You can get people in all kinds of situations and they'll still, we did one of our first episodes we did was Viktor Frankl. He's in a
Yeah.
concentration camp. He's still asking questions.
Yeah.
That's my one caveat on that thing. You know what I mean?
The question is resources, and time is a
Well, you're in a
resource.
concentration camp, you're fucked, but you're still
Right.
thinking. You know what I mean?
Right. What I'm saying is that like people, in the situations where they might not have the time to even give themselves the opportunity to look at those things. And I'm just thinking about people I know who I have talked to about this kind of thing. They just say, I don't have time for that. Now, granted, we can say what you mean to say is it's not a priority, right? Because that's the truth. But I
Yeah.
could say that most people fear what they don't know. And most people probably fear their fears. That's just my interpretation. I could totally be wrong. But that those kinds of things have a potential to draw at your psyche. When I believe that the whole of society, because of what we talked about with all of the necessities that you have to input yourself into in order to survive,
Mhm.
that it's stressful, the uncertainty of your relationships, the uncertainty of your job status, the uncertainty of the change of society, which is always there but higher now, I think. You can't be pulled down into these kinds of thoughts. Now, you and I might argue with this, Eric, and say, well, if you were to alchemize those fears, you would not be trapped by them as much as you are right now. Would you agree with that?
Are you saying the people kind of push them into the unconscious or something like that? I can't deal with this shit. This is overwhelming to me. I
Yeah,
can't emotionally handle this. I'm gonna squish
right,
this. Okay,
right,
that's
and
that's what you're kind of talking about. Yeah.
yeah, and that so therefore they put it away, and so they might be aware that it's there, but they're not going to go there because their life is already stressful.
Hmm.
Life is already difficult. So the idea of then taking your attention, taking your focus, and essentially meditating on fear will pull you into a potential place that you don't want to be in, that you might not have the tools to get out of. And then with the people who rely on you, you're doing this kind of work that you are probably, I'm not going to say unprepared to do, because I do think people have very deep and innate wisdom if they just allow themselves to go at it, you know?
Hmm.
But they're probably going to be scared that they're going to be in an emotional place where other people can't rely on them, and if they can't rely on themselves, they are now going to feel insecure, and they cannot feel insecure when they're, I'm going to go back to this word I used before, the provider, or a cog in the wheel into a larger wheel. And so the potential downsides to looking at these things for folks is very steep, I feel like. And they are just not going to allow themselves to go there. And then when time moves forward, now I'm speaking of somebody specifically who I'm very close with, and we have, this person avoids these conversations. I can tell you
Okay.
for sure.
Okay. Okay.
Why? Because of time. It's been so many years
Hmm.
of avoiding, so many years of just trying to focus on the next day, going to work, taking care of the family, blah, 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 that you're talking about years and years and years of things that have been, like you said, stuffed down, or we could say avoided, not worked on. You've gone this far. You're not probably going to go there, which is unfortunate to me in my relationship with this person I'm discussing. It's hurtful because I want to see this person emancipated from so many of the anxieties and fears that they walk around with. But I
Hmm.
know that there's nothing that I can say or do that is going to do that for them if they don't want to do that for themselves. So this entire soliloquy, I won't say diatribe, this entire soliloquy is born out of my interaction with one or two people who are elderly at this point and who have avoided any deep conversation around this or anything else for the last, I don't know, 10 years for sure. And it's disappointing to see, but I feel this very, very deeply.
Yeah, in the stages of the path, the sort of Buddhist philosophy stuff, this is preciousness of human life and then the reality of like mortality, that none of our lives is going to last forever. And so, you don't want to look back on things with things that you didn't face because then there'll be regret, right?
Mhm.
Or and some of the Taoist stuff and probably Buddhist stuff too, the idea will be that you're just going to have to face these things at some future life anyways, right? So that does try to prime you to be a little bold to face these things in the now. I guess what fascinates me about this as we get to sort of the end of this,
Yeah.
5 minutes or something, but then some of this becomes potentially karmic, you know?
Okay, I understand what you mean
No,
now.
I mean, it's not
Yeah.
just like it's just my attachment issues from this life. This is my attachment issues that I'm like carrying on. I haven't resolved these things, right? Now, if you're in like evolutionary psychology kind of model, like the way the attachment theory thing is, you say, well, it all comes from when you're younger, right? Things happened in your life. But it is true that sometimes you look back and people and you're like, well, I don't know where this is entirely coming from, right? It's not just from this life. As a
Right.
shaman, you might say, oh, no, this is your lineage, right? It's
Yes.
carrying on through that route. As a Buddhist person, you might say, oh, no, this is the karma associated with your spirit that never got resolved, right? Either way,
Yeah.
something hasn't been resolved.
Yeah.
No matter where you want to source it. If you
Mm.
want to take it back through the lineage, or if you want to take it back through your own collected karmic seeds. You kind of use that metaphor in Buddhism, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't, then there's a real incentive to resolve these things when you can, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that has its own set of like interesting questions I thought we should just throw up before the end of the episode too, because that's something worthwhile thinking about too.
Very good point.
And with the idea like, okay, strike when you can, right? You gotta like take that attitude,
Mm-hmm.
right? When the opportunity is there, maybe try to resolve these things when you have the chance to do it.
You know,
Also, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Uh-huh.
they say strike when the iron's hot. And you know me, Eric, the iron's always fucking hot. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, timing, patience, and
Yeah.
I get it. But also, I don't know. It just
Might
don't,
as well do it now and get it over with, right?
some things you can't wait on, you know? Some things you can't wait on.
So then, like, if I'm trying to pull this all together in my own mind, audience
Do
too,
it. Do it.
because it's not an easy set of questions. Then you get this idea, well, I have to be able to challenge my fears,
Yes.
and that's part of the attachment
Hmm.
theory. I can't be so dominated by because a lot of this stuff in the attachment theory ultimately boils down to some kind of fear,
Yeah.
right? Whether I'm avoidant or whether I'm anxious or whatever it is, there's some kind of fear underlying this, right? These kind of very primal emotions, right? In our nine things that will fuck up your life episode, this is like number one.
Hmm.
This feeling of like, oh, I feel these insecurities, which are natural to feel,
Yeah.
right? And even from a spiritual point of view, if I'm always anxious, worrying about my security, it's like not that easy to meditate. It's hard,
No.
right? So there is a value in having some kind of sense of security. But then there's the other side where I have to deal with facing whatever my fears are around this. And then where also do I get my dynamism? So I don't know. Like I really did ask these questions kind of deep. This is kind of the capper of this for us.
Mm.
I've put a lot of kind of personal thought into this over the years. And then as we were doing these episodes, this is always very thought provoking.
Hmm.
And yeah, we had conversations about this again, even over our retreat. So I think because I didn't feel like so tied into like having to be an exclusiveness mindset, I didn't have that mindset anymore, right? Which probably had a lot to do with like being a Zen person, a Taoist person, a Tantric person. I was like, well, I don't have to follow the codes of the world that I live in. I can kind of write my own rules. So
Mm.
I had that thought in my mind. And I thought, well, realistically speaking, I have to acknowledge that we all have our need for some kind of sense of security and stability, right? We're going to
Hmm.
have yin needs. And then for me, it was, okay, I guess the yang needs would be like my acknowledging that I can have connections with other people that can be deep and meaningful in a way that I don't have to worry about whether this violates some sense of like exclusiveness or something,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's how I tried to solve it personals, just to throw it out to people who are listening, right? And I thought, well, to the extent that I need to challenge my fears, I'll try to do that, right? Whether those are fears of wherever that fits along that continuum. But I wanted to throw it out there because it's not easy questions. And so in the end, I thought, okay, well, this is how I tried to do it. Definitely saying there's no like perfect way to do this, right?
Right.
And then, other people, I guess, will try to figure out in their own ways. But it's a quintessential, like deep set of issues of how you try to get these different needs met.
Hmm.
And then the way it's like beyond even the sexual. Sometimes when you think about this, it will be like, well, I have to have like a sexual relationship for this with this same person for like 40 years. I was kind of thinking like that when you're a teenager and you first start like jerking off, you don't think I'm going to get married and I'll be with that same person for 40 years. This is so hot. No one thinks that. When they're a teenager, no one has that thought.
Yeah. Whenever you want to do relationship counseling, do not go see Eric.
No one has that thought. No, but it's sexual imprinting too. No one has that thought, right?
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. So now you can see me. It's totally fine. I'll respect wherever you're at. It's totally fine.
So I was like, Eric, we've been married for
You
25
tell me when you were
years.
a teenager, you were sitting there fantasizing about having sex with the same person for 40 years, Daniel. Come on. Come on, bro.
Come on, bro. No, for
No
sure
one
not.
has that thought.
No, no,
That's
definitely not.
fantasy. So, anyways, I mean, that's this Esther Perel being honest.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, I hear that.
Anyways, so a bit, but it's beyond that. When you start talking about spirituality, it's like, how do you have these yin and yang needs met in the sense that I can have enough security, I can work on myself spiritually, right?
Yeah, yeah,
About those anxieties, and I also can have some freedom to explore the world
yeah.
in a way I can be, have that freedom, like, and that's true whether or not you're going to be an exclusiveness person or uniqueness person, whoever you are.
Yeah,
But I think that's the challenge, I guess, right?
that's it. Well, that's the question.
Yeah.
Uh, Security, exploration, and attachment. How does it
Yeah.
fit for you?
Yeah. I think that's right.
That's it. Well, Eric, that's the perfect place to leave it.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thank you so much for being here, audience. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you've made it to the end of the episode, you are in the top 5% of attention in the world. Matter of fact, in the galaxy or the multiverse, even.
Yeah.
Because they all have TikTok. It's made its way through to all the universes, actually. It's very
All
strange.
those all those waves are going to all the universes.
That's right. We're melting them with our stupidity.
They're
Um,
going, what the fuck happened in this other universe?
yeah, man, I don't understand that one. But you know, as always, we appreciate everybody tuning in. Subscribe, like, whatever, hit us up. ginandtantra@gmail.com. Leave a comment in the YouTube, do your thing. Instagram, Gin and Tantra Podcast. If this is your first time, what's up? If this is your 10th time or 100th time or whatever episode we're on, what's cracking? We're creeping up on 5 years. And oh yeah, last thing I want to say, for the three people who are left here, uh, COVID, 5 years, man.
Oh yeah, wild.
5 fucking years. 5 years.
Yeah.
Remember where you were at that day when things got shut down. Eerie how similar some things are at this particular point. So there's
Yeah.
our society work.
Scars of that have never really fully healed, right?
Never. I'm gonna repost my COVID PTSD episode because we definitely ain't the same. You know?
Yeah.
Anyways, Eric, thank you. Audience, thank you. And for Eric, this is Daniel, because you guys are the next one. Deuces.